There is a country in the heart of Europe with no ocean coastline, no oil reserves, no vast agricultural plains, and almost no natural resources to speak of. Its terrain is dominated by mountains that make farming brutally difficult and infrastructure absurdly expensive to build. It has 4 official languages, a fragmented cultural identity, and for most of its early history, it was one of the poorest, most violent places on the continent, exporting mercenary soldiers because that was the only commodity it had to offer the world. Today, that country has the highest median wealth per adult on Earth. Its chocolate is a luxury brand, its watches are heirlooms, its banks hold the secrets of the world's fortunes, and its citizens live, on average, longer than almost anyone else alive. That country is Switzerland. Now think about Africa, a continent so enormous it could swallow the United States, China, India, and most of Europe and still have room left over. A landmass sitting on top of some of the greatest natural wealth in human history: gold, diamonds, cobalt, coltan, oil, fertile river deltas, ancient trade routes, and more biodiversity than almost anywhere else on the planet. A continent that gave the world its first civilizations, its first mathematics, its first writing. Yet today, Africa is home to 33 of the world's 40 poorest nations. More than 400 million of its people survive on less than $2 a day. How does that make any sense? That's what we're going to figure out today. And I promise you, the real answer is far more disturbing, far more human, and far more hopeful than you've been told.
Let's start with the story most people reach for first: geography. The geographer Jared Diamond argued convincingly that the physical shape of the world gave some civilizations an enormous head start. Europe and Asia sit on a horizontal axis. You can travel east to west across them and stay in roughly the same climate zone. That meant crops, animals, ideas, and technologies could spread freely across thousands of miles. Wheat grown in the Fertile Crescent reached Spain. Horses domesticated in Central Asia reached Britain. The continent was one long, connected highway of innovation. Africa, meanwhile, sits on a vertical axis, north to south. Travel down the continent and you cross multiple climate zones: Mediterranean, Saharan desert, tropical rainforest, savanna, and back to desert again. Crops don't cross those barriers easily. Neither did animals or writing systems or the kind of agricultural surplus that lets a civilization build cities and armies and universities. And then there's the coastline problem. Africa's coastline is actually shorter relative to its landmass than almost any other continent's. That might sound like a trivial geographic footnote, but it's enormous. Natural harbors are how civilizations have always traded. No harbors means no merchant fleets. No merchant fleets means no trade wealth. No trade wealth means no investment, no surplus, no compounding economic growth. Switzerland, for all its landlocked disadvantages, sits at the crossroads of Europe's river systems. The Rhine connects it to the North Sea and the German industrial heartland. The Rhone connects it to the Mediterranean. Even without an ocean coast, Switzerland was essentially plugged into the veins of European commerce for centuries. Geography, then, does matter, but here's where the story gets complicated, because geography alone cannot explain what happened. If it could, the Democratic Republic of Congo, with its mineral wealth and the Congo River, the second most powerful river on Earth, should be one of the richest places in the world. Instead, it is one of the poorest. Geography set the stage, but it didn't write the play. To find the real engine of the difference, you have to go back to the 1880s, specifically to a meeting room in Berlin. In 1884 and 85, the major European powers sat around a conference table and divided an entire continent among themselves. No African leader was invited. No African voice was heard. In the span of a few months, King Leopold II of Belgium claimed the Congo, a territory 76 times the size of Belgium, as his personal property. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, and Italy carved up coastlines, river valleys, and kingdoms they had never seen, drawing borders with rulers across maps that were still mostly blank.
Those borders cut directly through the territories of over 1,000 different ethnic groups. They separated communities that had traded and intermarried for generations. They lumped together people who had been sworn enemies for centuries. And then, when colonialism finally ended in the mid-20th century, those same arbitrary borders were locked in place because the international community decided that changing them would cause chaos. The chaos, it turned out, was already built in. But the borders were only the beginning. What colonialism actually did, and this is the part that economics professors sometimes call the Great Extraction, was build entire governing systems designed not to develop the local population, but to drain it. Roads were built in Africa, yes, but they went from mines to ports. Railways were laid, but they ran from resource-rich interiors to coastal shipping points. The infrastructure of colonial Africa was never meant to connect Africans to each other. It was meant to connect African resources to European markets. And when the colonizers left, they left behind governments that had been built on that same logic. Governments that extracted from their own people. Bureaucracies that existed to capture resources for a small elite, not for providing services for citizens. Courts that protected the powerful rather than the property of ordinary people. The political scientists Darren Agamolu and James Robinson, in their landmark book, Why Nations Fail, called these extractive institutions, and they argued persuasively that they are the single greatest predictor of national poverty. Switzerland, meanwhile, had spent those same centuries building the opposite. By the 1300s, the Swiss Confederation had already established a system of governance built on consensus, mutual defense, and local autonomy. Swiss cantons developed strong traditions of property rights, rule of law, and civic participation. When an ordinary Swiss farmer invested in improving his land, he could be reasonably confident that no lord could take it from him. That confidence, that fundamental security of investment, is not a small thing. It is arguably everything. Here's a psychological truth that economists rarely put in their papers, but that is absolutely central to understanding wealth and poverty. People only invest in the future when they believe the future is safe enough to invest in. Think about that for a moment. If you're a farmer in colonial-era Congo and you know that the Belgian rubber quota requires you to deliver a fixed weight of rubber or face mutilation, you are not thinking about crop rotation or market strategy. You are thinking about survival. If you're a small business owner in a country where the government can seize your assets on a whim, you don't build a factory, you hide your money. If your country has been at war on and off for 30 years, you don't plant trees whose fruit you won't live to harvest. Economists call this the discount rate, how heavily people weight the present versus the future. In stable, secure societies, people have low discount rates. They're willing to sacrifice today for a payoff 10 or 20 years from now. In unstable, insecure societies, the discount rate skyrockets. The future feels too uncertain, too dangerous to plan for. And when millions of people in a country all have high discount rates at the same time, the result is exactly what you'd expect. Underinvestment, short-termism, and the kind of slow economic stagnation that looks from the outside like laziness or failure of culture, but is actually a completely rational response to an irrational environment. Switzerland's extraordinary stability, it has not fought a war on its own soil since 1815, over 200 years ago, has allowed its citizens to plan generationally. Swiss banks didn't become famous overnight.
They became trusted repositories of wealth because they operated under consistent laws in a stable country for decades and then centuries. That trust compounded. The world's wealth flowed in, and Switzerland earned a fee for holding it.
Now, here's the part of this story that most people find hardest to sit with: the resource curse. Africa is extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources, and that wealth has, paradoxically, made many of its nations poorer. When a country discovers oil or diamonds or cobalt, it suddenly has something that powerful outside interests desperately want. That creates an incentive for foreign corporations and for domestic elites to capture control of the resource rather than to build a productive economy around it. The history of the Niger Delta tells this story brutally. Nigeria sits on billions of barrels of oil. Since the 1960s, that oil has generated hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue, and yet the Niger Delta, the communities closest to the oil, have among the lowest life expectancy, the highest child malnutrition rates, and the worst drinking water access in all of Nigeria. The oil money didn't build hospitals and schools, it built mansions in Abuja and accounts in Geneva. It funded militia groups and bribed government officials. It turned the Delta into a war zone. The cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo is another devastating example. Cobalt is essential for the batteries that power electric cars and smartphones, the technologies the developed world is counting on to save the planet. 60% of the world's cobalt comes from Congo. Much of it is mined by hand, by workers, some of them children, who earn a few dollars a day in conditions that human rights organizations have compared to slavery. The companies buying that cobalt are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. The miners are dying. Switzerland, by contrast, had nothing to be extracted. That absence, the absence of the thing that made colonial exploitation worth doing, was its protection. Nobody came for Switzerland's watchmaking knowledge. Nobody enslaved its mountain farmers for their cheese. Its poverty in the medieval period was the poverty that forces innovation. The Swiss had to solve their own problems, build their own markets, develop their own skills, because nobody was coming to save them or to plunder them.
Now here's the part of this story that most people find hardest to sit with: the resource curse. Africa is extraordinarily wealthy in natural resources, and that wealth has, paradoxically, made many of its nations poorer. When a country discovers oil or diamonds or cobalt, it suddenly has something that powerful outside interests desperately want. That creates an incentive for foreign corporations and for domestic elites to capture control of the resource rather than to build a productive economy around it. The history of the Niger Delta tells this story brutally. Nigeria sits on billions of barrels of oil. Since the 1960s, that oil has generated hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue. And yet, the Niger Delta, the communities closest to the oil, have among the lowest life expectancy, the highest child malnutrition rates, and the worst drinking water access in all of Nigeria. The oil money didn't build hospitals and schools. It built mansions in Abuja and accounts in Geneva. It funded militia groups and bribed government officials. It turned the Delta into a war zone. Let's talk about something else that rarely makes it into the economics textbooks: the role of education as a compounding force. Switzerland made a serious, sustained, culturally embedded commitment to education beginning in the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s. Reformers like Zwingli and Calvin believed that every Christian should be able to read the Bible personally. That theological conviction had a secular side effect. It made mass literacy a religious obligation. By the 1700s, Switzerland had literacy rates that were extraordinary for the era. Literate populations learn faster.
adapt more quickly, and generate more innovation per capita. One generation trains the next. The compound interest of literacy over 3 or 4 centuries is almost impossible to overstate. Africa's literacy crisis is not the result of intellectual failure. It is the result of an education system that was deliberately designed under colonialism to produce a small class of compliant clerks, not a broadly educated citizenry. The mission schools taught what was useful to the empire. When independence came, the new nations inherited educational infrastructure built for a different purpose, and not nearly enough of it. Today, things are changing with extraordinary speed. Africa has the fastest growing middle class on Earth. Mobile phone penetration has leapfrogged entire generations of banking infrastructure. Rwanda, which lived through perhaps the most horrifying genocide in the late 19th century, has rebuilt itself into one of the fastest growing economies in the world through ferocious investment in governance reform, anti-corruption measures, and technology. Ethiopia's Addis Ababa is becoming a continental hub for aviation and finance. Ghana has maintained democratic governance for over 2 decades. The story is not fixed.
So, what is the real answer to this question? It is not that Swiss people are smarter, or more hardworking, or more virtuous. Walk through Lagos or Nairobi, and the work ethic you encounter will take your breath away. Informal market vendors who start before sunrise, engineers coding apps for global markets, farmers coaxing food from difficult soil with almost no support. The talent is not the problem. The answer is that Switzerland, through a combination of fortunate geography, centuries of institutional development, political stability, the protection that came from having nothing worth stealing, and the freedom to invest in the long-term future, accumulated advantages that compounded over generations. Africa, through a combination of geographic challenge, deliberate colonial destruction of functional institutions, the curse of resource wealth that attracted extraction rather than development, arbitrary borders that created permanent ethnic conflict, and the betrayal of post-colonial governments that often continued the extractive logic of their predecessors, accumulated disadvantages that compounded just as relentlessly. Wealth and poverty are not accidents. They are not destiny. They are the residue of decisions. Decisions made by kings and colonial administrators, by international creditors and arms dealers, by domestic strongmen and the foreign governments that propped them up for geopolitical convenience. The gap between Switzerland and Africa is not a gap between success and failure. It is in large part the same story told from 2 different sides of the same transaction. Understanding that doesn't make the solution simple, but it does make the problem honest. And honesty, as it turns out, is always where the real work begins.